Good morning.
Good morning,
How are you,
everyone.
Carolyn?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Wow. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session. I am Marisol Quevedo de Rucha, and my partner is Dr. Carolyn Journey. So we are talking about increasing equity via deeper connections. So this is our first time managing HUVA and managing, because that's where your comments and questions are going to go. So if you have any questions for us throughout our time together today, please make sure and type it into HUVA. And Dr. Carolyn and I are going to take turns trying to capture everything that's in HUVA and make sure that we're answering your questions. We also invite any, if there's any statements or anything that you want to share, go ahead and drop it in there, and we will make sure to stop and share that out for the group. So we're asking for you to please, in the chat, please share why you are here, specifically why you chose to be in our session today, and where you're from. So if you could do that throughout, and while we are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we have me and Dr. Gary here. Dr. Carolyn, so Carolyn, could you please introduce yourself to our participants today? And please talk about not just your work, but who you are in all realms of your life.
Yes. So hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I am joining you from Colorado Springs, Colorado. I actually grew up in San Diego. And then from there, I started my teaching career as an educator in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai. I started teaching Spanish there a long time ago. And I was there for about 10 years. And after that, I moved to Berkeley with my family, and I was part of the accreditation process there with Berkeley Unified and Berkeley High School, and worked on the redesign of the very large comprehensive high school into small learning communities. And then we were there for about 6 years, and then we moved to Colorado. We're really huge mountain bikers. And it's in Colorado that I first started to engage with charter schools as a school administrator. And then I opened 2 charter schools kind of in the urban corridor of Colorado Springs. And both schools were K-8 schools. We consolidated into one. And we were really serving a pronounced need. Within the community, we became kind of that center where a lot of various agencies would send families when they were actually meeting a lot of challenges within their home schools. So we became that school that really followed the community-based wraparound model. And then after that, I was a school administrator for a statewide alternative high school that was a blended model where we had drop-in centers throughout the state. And now, most recently, I'm in higher education. I work as a research affiliate with the National Institute for Human Resilience at UCCS. I also teach courses in innovation and entrepreneurship. And then I work with development around health equity issues for the El Paso County Department for Public Health. So that is me in a nutshell.
Carolyn, can you just share a little bit more about why you have really delved into this work around equity, and I think also that combination of equity and healing?
Yes, and I would say really from the beginning when I was in college and I was working as a bilingual teacher's assistant at an immersion school, I started to see how just early trauma and crisis would play out with our very young students. I worked in a first grade classroom. And although I was seeing these things, I didn't necessarily understand, what was causing the different behaviors or the different patterns, but I was very aware that there had to be some level of connection. When I was working in Kauai, we actually experienced a very Cat 4 Hurricane Iniki, that devastated the island. And I was already aware that there was this massive divide. We had students who lived in camps on the beach, and we had very affluent students as well from the North Shore. And there was a lot of generational poverty. There was a lot of historical trauma as well in Hawaii. And, you know, what I saw at the elementary school in terms of the very visible effects of not only child abuse, but also, you know, generational abuse play out. By the time the students would get to the high school, a lot of that was very much under the surface. And so, you know, just understanding students from that continuum, I again started to realize that there was this very huge need to think about something beyond, you know, just following the academic components of learning, because there were this whole other realm that really influences that. And in Berkeley, it was very much the same, where we had a lot of students who also experienced homelessness. Some even lived, you know, in the high school building when they were unable to get shelter for that evening. And at that point, it was a very, very large high school. So developing a common understanding among staff that, you know, when we talk about what we were seeing in terms of academic achievement data, you can't have or house that conversation just in a silo, that you really have to look at all of these other things that come into play when you're trying to understand how best to meet the needs of the students. And so we had a lot of very engaging, very heated discussions, and started to dig into the work around accreditation and equity, you know, at that point. Fast forward to Colorado, and then working with our K-8 community-based school. It's then that I started to dig into the research about the impact of early trauma, and started to put those pieces together, because we saw a lot of patterns emerge around our achievement data, but we also were seeing a lot of stories about some of the structures and systems that we were putting in place to build trust with our families, that was resulting in students really starting to thrive, but they were thriving in ways that we weren't always able to capture. And so now just continuing that work, shifting over to a resiliency focused lens, and then really digging into how there is this overlay between how communities, whole communities are impacted, especially when you look at things like health disparities and how that impacts substance abuse, it impacts trauma, it impacts generational trauma, and that all feeds into our work as educators as well. So is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I also just want to say good morning again to all of our participants. We had originally, when we planned, thought that we would be able to really engage with you. So fortunately, we do have Huva, and I do want to say good morning. So Clint is here. He's looking forward to the conversation about equity and hearing from our community of educators. Hello to Emily from Youth Build. We have people from California, from Job Corps. We have a woman named Lori who teaches adults ages 22 through 74 who are pursuing their high school diploma and who are immigrants and who are learning English. So just really beautiful work. Cynthia from Albuquerque says that she enjoys being in spaces where equity is focused and healing is the outcome, when equity is at the core of the work. And Liz is here from San Diego. Hello, fellow San Diegan, and really wants to continue the work of promoting a culture of equity. Hello to everybody from Elk Grove. So I just wanted to say hello. Thank you so much again for being with us this morning. I am Marisol Quevedo Rerucha. I am most importantly the mother of Camerina, Emilia, and Sofia. Camerina is 26, Emilia is 25, Sofia is 15. I am the daughter to Irma and Abraham, and I am the grandmother to Isabela Luna and Cynthia Iliana, and I'm the granddaughter of Camerina, Alejandro, Francisco, and Carmen. And the reason why I introduce myself in that way is because I recognize that every single space that I have the opportunity to be in, I carry the voices, I carry the hopes, I carry the dreams, I carry the challenge I carry the pain of all of those that have come before me, all of those who have poured into me, and all of those who have prayed for me. And so I don't take this opportunity to be with you lightly. I don't take any opportunity to be in any room that I'm in lightly, because I carry the responsibility of my community. And not only that, I carry the hopes and the dreams and really the prayers for our future ancestors. So it's really important to me to just take that moment and acknowledge where I come from. So I was a career educator, middle high school English teacher, and I went into education because I wanted to be the person that my friends and I did not have in high school. And, you know, I graduated from high school in 1992 here in San Diego, and barely graduated from high school. One semester I had a 0.5 GPA. So I was definitely, and my friends were definitely what you would consider at promise youth. One of my friends was in prison for some time after we graduated from high school because she was crossing drugs in her children's car seat at the international border. I have another friend who had her baby in prison because she was crossing, I don't remember how many pounds of drugs across state lines. And unfortunately, I have not really been able to connect with her after her daughter was born. But I share that with you because I made the choice to go into education wanting to be that person that we didn't have. And I will tell you that we were very good at manipulating and saying the things that adults wanted to hear because it was convenient. And I also went into education because I was a young mom. I was 19 years old when I had my daughter, 21 when I had my second daughter, and really wanted to create stability for them. And I found education to be the way. So I moved into administration at an elementary school district, and there had the most profound professional development of my life. I really loved middle and high school, but the learning that I had in the elementary school system regarding students, but like functions of behavior, and also really learning how to take care of staff. Because as a teacher, I was a mama bear. I wouldn't let anybody mess with my kids. But when I took on that role and that responsibility of leading a school, I had to learn and understand that it was my most important job was taking care of my staff because they were the people who were taking care of our kids. From there, I moved to an alternative charter high school, 7 miles from Tijuana, 7 miles from the city of San Diego in Chula Vista. And that's where I fell in love really with this work, with this population of students. I then moved to the county office where I led career readiness and CTE for the juvenile court and community schools. So just really amazing work and amazing people that I've had the profound honor to work with. And it was really in JC, at the juvenile court school system, where I really began implementing restorative practices with my staff. And made the decision to leave the system. I started out as a consultant, so I do consulting, and I also am now working full-time with the National Parents Union as their Chief of Partnerships and Strategies, so doing really amazing work with parents who really are demanding to be a part of decision-making that's happening for their children in their communities on both a local, state, and national level. So just really blessed to be doing this work and talking about equity and talking about healing in every single space that we can. And Carolyn and I met, it's been about 8-9 years now, because we were both fellows with the National Institute for Latino School Leaders with Unidos US that used to be the National Council of La Raza. And that program, that organization, brought us together, and what really connected me with Carolyn was her talking about the work that she was doing at SLA. She was talking about resiliency, talking about grit, talking about being trauma-informed, 10, 12 years ago. And when we met, she was already deeply engaged in the work. And very fortunately, we've started doing this work together. So today, here is the review of our outcomes, what we're hoping to get to. We're going to be talking about critically reflective practice and how that can be used to really connect to self, others, and community. Examine the connection between restorative practice, trauma-informed, and resiliency-focused processes, and community healing. and develop an understanding of these practices in the context of your community. And also hopefully connecting with others committed to this work. So if you're seeing people that are making comments, you know, that you're really connecting with in the Whova chat, please make sure that you connect with them and send them a message in that app as well. So Carolyn, can you just talk about equity?
Yes. Yes, and so, you know, their equity right now, I feel is really kind of more at the forefront in terms of our national dialogue, if you will, than I've ever seen it actually before. And I'm heartened by that. And I'm also, at the same time, I'm also really cognizant that it's going to take a concerted effort to really make sure that it continues to be, you know, at the forefront of what we talk about. Here that we've defined it as being access, opportunity, and belonging, and that there is this imperative that our systems and our classrooms shift from the idea of equal, which is described as leveling the play as a level playing field, to equity, which is more for those who need it. And when I really think about equity and I go back to this concept of belonging and what that looks like and how that plays out, you know, within society and within our learning environments, it's really that sense of I am really part of this intellectual community. I'm really part of this learning community. And that means that I'm valued, I'm heard, I'm seen in every aspect. And then Marisol, you have a beautiful way too of really capturing equity.
Well, I think I also, you know, thinking about this work of equity, it's really what we propose is that this is the work of self, and that equity is more than just something that you do, just like being trauma informed is more than something that you do, or restorative practices is more than something that you do. It's really about who you are. It's really about having not just a mindset based in equity, but a heart set based in equity. And I think that I want to just use this example around mindset. So we know that a mindset is a mental attitude or inclination. But Dr. Floyd Cobb and John Crownapple have written a really beautiful book called Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. And it really gets to the heart of equity work. And what they talk about, you know, their mindset with this work is that dignity stands above differences and that every person has dignity. And that we need to recognize the dignity of every student and also of our staff. And that is what is essential in equity work. I also talk about, I have a book coming out on restorative practices in January, and I talk about heart set because it's about the mind and the heart connection. And I think, you know, a lot of times people talk about their passion or what it is that drives them, but it's really having that heart set for equity. So equity isn't just something that you talk about and something you fight for, but it's really what you live and breathe in all areas of your life. And it's also a lens that you have, just like being restorative. Like you either have a restorative heart set or you don't. You can learn how to have an equity heart set and mindset, how to have a restorative heart set and mindset. But it's this connection between your mind and your heart. And you know, this work, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to you to talk about critically reflective practice.
So I'm sure that many of you are very aware, you know, of reflective practice, especially as it relates to you as a practitioner. But I want to lift this out right now and really emphasize that when we use this and we're really using it in a very authentic way, talking about that heart set and that mindset, that's really about putting your most authentic self out there, right? And that's really through how well you know yourself and how aware you are of the impact that your actions have on others. And I'm going to take this way back to my first few years as a teacher. And I know that there were many days and many times when I would end the day, close the door in my classroom, go home and think like, that did not go well today for a number of reasons. That's why I felt that way. And I would start to like work it out in my head in terms of like what went right, what went wrong, what could I do to really improve that. And that on one level, is, an example of using reflective practice. But when you take it and you frame it through this lens of equity and really being self-aware, then it's also having that awareness and building that learning around how your actions impact others, especially when you're coming from a place of privilege, and then recognizing the power of the words and the power of those actions to either encourage, that everybody does feel like they belong within that learning community, or if that actually puts up walls, that does not encourage that and actually keeps people out. And so when we talk about, this work in terms of critically reflective practice, it does, like Marisol was saying, really, it's nested in that space of truly knowing yourself, which I don't know, Marisol, if you want to talk anything, add anything to that, or shall we just get right into the relational piece?
Well, I think, all of the work, I think this is, we're all human beings. And in our humanity, the more that we are able to really get to know ourselves and be honest with ourselves about who we are and why we are. And I think also one measure for me is, my hope is that all of us are really trying to be the best versions of ourselves. And in order for us to be that best version of ourselves, we have to be really honest about what's keeping us from being so. And those things that are keeping us from being so can be based in our trauma. They can be based from harmful childhood experiences. They can be based in our own egos. They can be based in our self-esteem, the way we value ourselves, messages that we received, negative messages that we received from others that at some point in our life we decided were true. And so really digging in and doing that work, getting to know ourselves, really then allows us, when we get to that part of really being aware of who we are, why we're making decisions, why we react in ways that we do, why we may be triggered by something, and being able to go through a reflective practice, centering in that and being authentic about that, and being able to share that with others and share that experience with others, being vulnerable in sharing that. It helps us connect as human beings and helps us be able to start to do the work with one another in a very honest way. And I think that, the reason why equity, the fight for equity exists is because there are powers, there are structures that exist both in our, in our society that our systems are based on and our schools are based on. But these systems, they come from a place of a power trying to be of oppressing, a system of oppression. And that oppression, comes from people who feel the need to oppress and the need to control. And so the way that we need to dismantle that is by starting to really delve into those things that we carry within ourselves, those instincts or those practices, those negative practices that we carry within ourselves, so that we can start to really break into the system. But we have to be honest. And so honest with who we are and why we are. So I think that is just a really important piece of this work, is really facing into our pain and doing our own internal work.
So this relational piece, and doing that internal work, you can, just looking at the image within this slide, I really like the fact that it's represented by circles. And a big part of the book that Marisol authored is really digging into restorative circles and the power of restorative circles. But when we just take that apart and we look at this idea of a circle and the circle around the self, that really is how you understand yourself, and then through that understanding, how you relate to others and how you build trust with others. And so you are nested definitely by those relationships within your family, who those people who you consider to be your family, that very close personal sphere of those who you can be yourself, or perhaps because of maybe the nature of the history within your family, there may be other dynamics. But within that, then you expand that out to your work. And often I've heard many people talk about like their work family, because those relationships are so close and they also spend so much time, with those individuals. But again, sometimes you carry different elements of yourself into those relationships in different ways, right? Some that you may be very aware of and others that you may not. But again, coming back to that critically reflective piece and understanding, how those relationships play out and how your actions impact others in terms of your work and what you're engaged with. I think that is the most important part. And I don't want to forget the role of community, because we really have to be focused on communities, especially right now, because there are a lot of communities that are experiencing a lot of trauma and a lot of pain, and not just solely from the impact of COVID, but also because there's been a historical just level of perhaps being under-resourced, or there have been other elements within that community where the result is that they've been cut off, or they have felt like they have not been able to really collectively rely upon the strength that they have for many reasons. But really also, let's be honest, because there are things in play in terms of systemic racism and also inequalities that are just baked into the system. So when we talk about this work and we talk about it through the lens of the relational capacity that we have, then we have to talk about how well we know ourselves, and we have to talk about trust in order to move this work forward.
And so one of the practices that I want to share with you is just thinking about the ways, thinking about the world right now. What are things that are being done to you or being done to us as a society? And how are we choosing to respond?
So how are you choosing then to respond to what is happening? And so I think maybe just take a moment, think about that a little bit, and just reflect upon that as well.
So the power went out in my house. Sorry.
That was a quick return though, thankfully.
Well, because I have my phone is on. Is my video on?
Your video is not working, but we can hear you.
Okay. Are you able? So the slides. So I don't think that the slides are going to move.
The slides went away.
Yeah. So my computer. So I'm sorry, everybody. The computer. My power went off in my house.
Okay.
Welcome to 2020. So the question, like, what is being done to us and how are we choosing to respond? So we can think about these things, for example, right now. So the power went off in my house, right? So my responsibility for carrying through, showing you the slides, going through that got stopped. So the question then is, how am I responding? Am I responding with anger? Am I responding with a sense of, oh my gosh, I knew this was going to happen. I've been, really nervous about this presentation. I sat through the COVID-19 trauma presentation at 9 o'clock that was phenomenal. I'm starting to feel like, is what I have to say important? Is what I have to bring to the table meaningful? So these are all the thoughts that are going through, right? But do I accept them? So I accept those thoughts that are going through in these moments of many crises. And do I accept that voice in my head that is trying to continue to convince me that my value is less than? And the answer to that is I'm not going to accept that, because I understand that I am in control of how I respond and how I react to the circumstances around me. With COVID happening, people, the mask mandate, social distancing, these things are very hard, and people feel like there's somebody trying to do something to them. But how are they responding? And what we have is we have the power to choose our reactions. And so when our reactions are off, when our reactions are negative, or go into blaming, or go into that horrible space of self-doubt, and that horrible space of negative talk, we have some choices about how we're going to get through that. And so one of the questions is, what is the work that we all have to do? Is it work that you need to do around reflection? Is it the work of your ego? Do you need to do some work around releasing control? Is this work around your self-esteem? Do you need potentially to go to therapy? Do you need to look at, the fact that you're starting to feel like you've been victimized, that you're a victim in your life? Is it your trauma? Whatever your work is, you need to start doing the work. And this really comes from our belief that we have a responsibility to ourselves and our loved ones and our loved ones in our community to be the best version of ourselves. And in order to do that, then we must face what is keeping us from being so. We also believe that we find our own light by walking through our own darkness. By choosing to go into the darkness and being honest and sharing that journey with others, it allows people to see our humanity. And what that takes is vulnerability. And sharing and modeling vulnerability gives others the courage to embrace their darkness and live a more authentic life.
So Marisol, I am sharing my screen now and I have the presentation back up.
Okay, I can't see it. So Carolyn, but I know where we're at. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the power of healing. And, you know, the Japanese have this beautiful art. It's either called kintsukuroi or kintsugi. If you can please look at the images when you have an opportunity. But what they do is when something beautiful is broken, like a piece of beautiful pottery, they repair it with gold or silver, with something precious. And it turns into something that is even more beautiful because it has been broken. And going into this really difficult work of self can be hard because it opens up wounds and pain. And Rumi, who was a 12th century poet, said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And my experience, I would like to add to Rumi, if I can, that the wound is also the place where the light enters you and where we meet ourselves. And when we can do that work of meeting ourselves, then we can really start to do that work of going into our communities and fighting this fight for equity. And in order to do that, we have to also really focus on self-care. So I just really want to touch on two things regarding self-care. One is I really do not like that analogy of the airplane where you put the mask on first, because, you know, this is why I don't like that analogy. Because that is a crisis situation. And also, how many flights have you taken that you've never had to use that mask? That is a very, very crisis-centered type of analogy. And the reality is that we need to practice self-care. We need to practice self-love and filling our cup every single day. Iyanla Vanzant has this really beautiful quote, and it was on a show that she was on with Oprah, and she says, you know, it's not selfish to take care of yourself, it's self-full. And your cup needs to be full for you. And anything that flows out of that cup is for other people. So imagine filling your own cup just for you. What would that look like? A lot of educators, I feel like a lot of us think that we keep our cup full by doing for others. But really, that's the flowing over part. So what do we do to keep our cups full? And I will tell you that is a very hard question for people to really get to, because I think that we see that we fill our cups so that we can drain them. We fill our cups, if we ever get to full, it's only so that we can give everything away that's in there. And Carolyn, I also, you've been on the journey of self-care. We both have for a really, really long time. Can you talk a little bit more about self-care and how that then impacts our communities?
Right. And so when we think about self-care, I like to always bring it back to these areas within my life that I know if I'm not mindful of, I start to get very much off track. And I think Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, we're going to talk a little bit more about her later on, but she, and many of you may already be familiar with her work, The Deepest Well. And of course, she's also the Surgeon General for the state of California. But in her work, she really explores early trauma, and she talks about early trauma through the lens of these 6 components of care. And I like to frame self-care in that same way. You know, when you talk about sleep, mindfulness, exercise, nutrition, mental health, and well-being, exercise. I know all of those areas really really are very important to me. And then when I'm cognizant of those, it's not like I'm really great at all of those at all the time. Typically I'm off track in one place or another. But I know if all of those are off balance, I'm really feeling it, and my body will tell me that in very pronounced ways. When I'm engaged with the work that I do, I also tend to absorb many of the stories, and I become a part, I think, to some extent, within this work of the lives and the people who I'm working with. And sometimes I find that it's very difficult to create kind of a place where for me to go and to acknowledge that in order for me to do this good work, I'm going to have to take care of myself. One of the first things that always goes off the track for me is sleep. And then once I'm not sleeping, then I really want a lot of sugar. And then, and it keeps going, right? And then I become emotionally charged and frustrated. So I know there was one day when I thought that I had it handled. There was a lot of things that kind of coming at me in a lot of different aspects of my life. And it was one of those burnt toast red light days when I find myself at the school thinking again that I've got everything going. I'm working with staff members before the school day starts. We've got our before school day program. And then we would always do our morning meeting as a whole school, and everybody was in there in the gym. And I go in there and I think everything's great. I go back to the office and our art teacher's like, hey, wait a second. What is up with you? It's like your whole aura followed you, from the gym back to the office. And it was at that point I was like, I didn't have it. And it's one, being able to be okay with that once you realize that, and then also being able to rely upon those within your community to build that network of support, so that when the work becomes more than what we can handle, when our lives sometimes take front and center, and things happen within our immediate family that really impact our capacity, then we need to take a moment and really take care of ourselves, because that will be the only way that we're going to be able to sustain this work in the long haul. So now we're going to talk about individualism and collectivism. And Marisol, do you want to drive this piece, or are you still working on it? Okay, so she is coming back to us. All right. Okay. So for individualism and collectivism, we're going to really draw from the work of Zaretta Hammond. Okay, all right. There is low tech and there is high tech. And sometimes there's just a moment of we're going to do the best that we can today.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy we're here today. I'm so happy we're together today. So you know what? I actually want to fast forward a little bit. And I just want to jump into, and everybody will have access to these slides. Actually, you know what? Yes. So I'm very tempted to do a breathing technique right now, Carolyn.
Okay, let's go with it.
Well, so this is a breathing technique that is really important for, that can be used when you're doing transitions. It's a great technique that immediately relaxes you and refocuses you. And I think really, when we start doing, continue to do presentations, we should start with a technique to bring us into the space. And so what I want everybody to do, if you could please just, put your feet firmly on the ground, your hands on your lap if you want to close your eyes, or if you want to, just keep your eyes focused on the floor. I'm going to guide our technique. Go ahead and take a deep breath in, out, and inhale for 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Release your breath for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Inhale for 2, 3, 4, hold for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, release for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Inhale for 2, 3, 4, hold for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, release for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Inhale for 2, 3, 4, hold for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and release for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Were you able to do the technique?
Yes.
Okay, good. So can you go to the next slide?
Yes.
So this, I think, moving from really getting to know yourself, this is the concept in Lakesh, is a concept of our Mayan ancestors. And in Lakesh and Nahuatl means I am you, you were me. And this was a poem written by Luis Valdez, who was a Chicano playwright. He also wrote and directed La Bamba. And it's in English and Spanish. And I think that this really helps us connect with self and with community. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. Carolyn, you want to do the English and I'll do the Spanish?
Sure.
Tú eres mi otro yo.
You are my other me.
Si te hago daño a ti,
If I do harm to you,
me hago daño a mí mismo.
I do harm to myself.
Si te amo y respeto,
If I love and respect you,
me amo y respeto yo.
I love and respect myself.
So when we think about the need for equity, when we think about the need for healing and connection, it is because of this. What we put out into the world is what we receive. And at the core of everything is relationships. Carolyn, do you want to talk a little bit more about relationships?
Yes, and we did a bit when we talked about that relational piece, but it is that true connection to others. And I know that right now it is probably in an area of my life anyway, it's an area that I miss the most in not being able to have those interactions on a day-to-day with my friends, with other members within my family, with those who I work with, because we can do a lot of connecting through Zoom. But it's not the same really as being able to see somebody else. I'm also a hugger. And so I'm definitely missing that as well. But those relationships are at the core. And a relationship is truly dependent, as we've talked about that knowledge and that understanding of ourselves, about being able to reflect on how our actions impact others. But it's also realizing the value and the trust that once that's established, it's something that needs to be nourished, just like a plant is. You have to keep watering it. You have to realize when it's dying and there's something that you need to do. It takes that constant care around relationships. And these are all relationships that we have, as well as the relationship that we have with our community. So it's really at the core of what we talk about in terms of not just being trauma informed and really knowing someone else's story and being there for that story, but it is also being dedicated to what healing is and the work that's required for healing.
And it's really through relationships that we build our culture, that we build our school culture, that we build our family culture, that we build our societal culture. And that starts with, again, by really looking within ourselves, and then really that ability to connect with others. Once, having that culture in place and then continuing to support that culture, there's different structures that we can put into our work. And there's foundations that we talk about. Can you go to the next one? There's foundations that we talk about really needing to happen. And these foundations, these structures are a piece of what all systems already have, but we always recommend that you review these I'm going to call them statements, these foundational statements, that you review them at least annually. And if you are not if you are just using these statements as something that is being read at a board meeting and you're not living them, then this is now the time to really start to bring your community back together. And these foundations of support, these foundational statements are your agreements or your code or your norms of how you're going to work together, be together in your system, your beliefs about the work, the values, your mission, and your vision statements. So all of these different foundational statements should really be driving, they're what you use to drive your work. And what we've seen in a lot of the systems that we've gotten and support with, when there's kind of a lack of focus around equity or a lack of focus around students or a lack of focus, we go back to those statements. Or if there are a lot of issues that are happening in-house between staff, we go back to those agreements and those belief statements. Those are things that need to really be kept present and be treated as living documents, and not just something that was created once by somebody else, but created by everybody in your system and is brought back and really present during all of your meetings together, your times, your community celebrations, that those are things that you are really living. And now we're going to move to trauma because I see the slide.
But piggybacking on the piece around those foundational statements, and I just want to go back to what we've been talking about in terms of that really reflective piece, and do those hold true with the culture, and do those change over time? And sometimes they do, but being honest about that, being authentic about that, and also being able to have those structures in place where you can have those very honest conversations with each other. And that's at the core of equity also, right? Being able to have those very honest conversations with each other if what is happening within that culture is not jiving with those statements, with what you're stating, who you are and how you are with each other. So shifting to this concept of trauma and how this fits within this, we're going to talk a bit about being trauma informed and how that then moves to being resiliency focused. Literally, trauma is the way that we relate to our world. It's also what can trigger us. It's what can put us in that freeze or that fright or that flight mode, right, by various triggers. And as adults, we have found many different ways that we can cope with that when we experience it often. But sometimes there are things that are so deep within us that we don't even realize that we are being triggered and we are reacting in a certain way. When you shift that to the educational environment, there is the potential for a lot of harm, especially as we know, as educators immersed in the alt ed world, we're working with a lot of students who oftentimes are coming to us having experienced a lot of pain, having many different wounds that we may or may not be able to see. But essentially, they're coming to us to be embraced and to be loved, And so when we start to think about understanding trauma with the objective and the goal for healing, right, then we're really curious and we really want to know more about when we see behaviors, what is at the root of those behaviors, and really starting to dig into the information that we have, about those who we are serving, our students, as well as our families within our communities, and being able to do so with the desire for healing. So, oops, I'm driving. I forgot, Marisol, that I'm driving. And so, there's been so much work recently about what it means to be trauma informed. We talk a lot about the what that looks like. We don't always dig into then the how, and then once you start to surface that, once you start to know more about that, then what is it that we can do as a community to shift this to being resiliency focused? Because once we make that shift, then we have our efficacy coming into play, and we know that then we're able to access those places within us that make us strong, both individually and as a community. And then we can not only engage with the work of healing, but we can also just engage in a more successful way with others around us. And so those support systems grow. So when we look at the community supports for trauma and what is required to just build, strengthen, and support that culture, then we have to dig into the work as a community. And within that, we have to have that trust, going back to the foundational statements, right? Being able to honor what is said as a community and being able to hold each other accountable. And there is that full commitment to engage with this work. And there is that sense that together, we really can have that capacity to do that work. So what does that look like really within a school environment? When I was leading our school, our small but mighty school, we were at that point in time about 95% free and reduced with 95% free. And so the poverty rate was really high. We had close to 25% of our students and families who experienced homelessness to varying degrees. And so there were a lot of different things kind of in play. And there were things that we started to know, like those facts. But then there were things that we started to do intuitively that built this culture of love around our students and our families. That meant that families who often would go from school to school to school would stay with us, and we would just move the transportation to meet their needs. But as a school community and as a culture, we had to shift our perspective because it's not something that's always taught within schools of ed. You know, when you see behavior, you put discipline in place. Well, that didn't work in our school. It required a different way to frame it and a different way to think about behaviors. And behaviors then, things that one would maybe traditionally say, well, then that requires some kind of punitive action. We would reframe and rethink that as to why is that behavior coming up? Why is this child always experiencing that on a Monday after a weekend? You know, what is at the root cause of that? And then what can we do differently for that student so maybe they're not having that pain every Monday morning? That's a different way to look at behavior. And then it's also a different way to look at conflict. Marisol, do you want to talk a little bit about this too within the context of your school and what you learned?
I think, you know, the key to what you talked about, Carolyn, and that we haven't, you know, really talked about in depth is the component of love. And I think really being able to approach this work with not just love for our students and love for our staff, but also love for ourselves. And I think with that lens of love, it also, you know, love isn't always doing, it's not just the warm fuzzies, right? Like love is really digging deep and doing a lot of like doing the hard work because of love. And, you know, this work through trauma is hard. Sitting with somebody, you know, in their trauma is hard work, just as it is doing the work yourself. But I really think that if we can center ourselves in that emotion, that's what gets us through and can also support our communities, our students, our staff in really starting to, I think, also see the different ways and the different depths that love can really push us into doing this hard work of self and into doing the hard work of unpacking our trauma and doing the hard work of really being able to keep our trauma as the adults in the room in the space that it needs to be in so we can support others, support our students in doing that work. So that's why I think this work is so important, because we need to be connected and centered with self so that we're not over, pushing our things and our work onto our students, because our responsibility once we're in that school building is really to our kids and their well-being.
And when love is really at the core of that, right, then there is kind of that space then to house, when conflict does come up, to house that space, because it's coming from that place. We talked a lot about this in our school, and we also talked about different ways that you can express love for your students because they need to hear it, right? I love the way that you always make John's day better with your smile, and you always make sure that John's not sitting alone at lunch. I love the way that you care for other students in our classroom. I love how you express yourself in your poetry. the way that you talked about this tree is just beautiful. Like when a student hears that, what they're hearing is love, right? And same thing with our interactions with each other. And so that way, when we do have those hard conversations with each other, we know it's coming from that place. I think sometimes when we would first talk about this, some staff members would be like, wait a second, we're going to talk about love. Like, why are we talking about love at school? And Marisol, were you going to say something?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, Carolyn.
Okay, so does that mean I need to go quicker? Okay,
yes.
So trauma-informed, I'm going to go quickly through this. Trauma-informed is having the knowledge and demonstrating the knowledge of trauma. And that's really like knowing just not only the data behind the students, but the stories, right? And being able to listen to those stories with an empathetic ear from day one. And if you're creating that space, then you're also creating that space for belonging as well. And when we get to that place of being trauma informed, then we can start to focus on the strengths, using love again at the core to really lift those strengths out in our students, as well as our families. When you surface that intentionally, then students and colleagues and families start to be able to see that in themselves as well, as an area of strength. And this is definitely connected to restorative practices. It's at the core of restorative practices. I'm going to shift this to Marisol.
And so restorative practices is something that I think is it's a very familiar term to people, and which I'm really grateful for. Can you go to the next slide, please? Which I'm really grateful for. But one of the things that I think is really important for us to focus on is that restorative practices, it's really a way of being, and being able, and the way, so let me go backwards just a minute. So we begin with the work of self. So us doing our work, connecting with self, doing that, the hard work that we need to do, really allows us then to be vulnerable and authentic with and be able to connect and understand others and their humanity. Within that, being both trauma informed, resiliency focused, and also culturally competent, really then starts to create that culture for us to be systemically start pushing towards equity. And restorative practices is a way of being within that system. And it helps us create a safe and a brave space for healing to occur and for conflicts to either be talked about or even prevented. And really important is listening, empathetic and active listening, and also observation, which teachers and educators are a master of, because we know that communication is more than just what comes out of your mouth. It's the way people carry themselves, and it's differences in behavior. And different practices that you can use in a restorative practices culture is engaging in a community circle, doing a quick check-in and check-out during meetings, going into restorative justice, providing mediations, using circles to move from harm to healing. And also really important is being able to gather that data. So this work in this way of being, there's nothing new about it. It's not just a step-by-step practice. It really isn't a book that you can read and all of a sudden you're restorative. It's not just a training, it's really about a way of being. And we go back to that equity, heart set, and mindset. And this is again about your heart. And are you restorative or are you not? And if you can go from being punitive. I am very punitive based by nature. And I've learned how to be restorative. If you could go to the next slide. At the base, of course, is our agreements. Having a common set of agreements of how it is that you're going to work together effectively, how you're going to problem solve, and how you're going to hold each other accountable. I always recommend that whenever you have these agreements set in your group, and I really go into in more detail, if anybody's interested in any of this work, I can send you, a section from my book that has how to do this work with your staff. But really, like, you should be practicing these. What do the agreements look like in action, and what do they not? Go to the next slide, please. So within the practice, again, checking in and checking out, like doing that temperature check. How are your people doing? And that can be a really quick one word at the beginning of a meeting. It could be one word at the end of a meeting. It could be a longer, question that gives people just that time in that moment to really develop that sense of community. Even if it happens, even if it's a parent meeting with a parent, you know, that you see very infrequently, being able to connect in this way really supports the work and the culture that you are creating. Holding circles regularly, they can be restorative circles, you know, that you're really looking at restoring something that was harmed. They could be a community circle where you're just, you know, getting to know one another. There's really beautiful ways that you can do this circle work. And of course, mediation is bringing together when an incident of harm has happened, and this could be between students, between staff, between students and the staff, between staff, you know, and leadership, but having a trusted member guide that work together, guide that conversation. And again, if anybody is interested in this, please shoot us an email. We're going to share our information at the end, but you can shoot me an email and I'll send this to you. So just go ahead and skip, we'll skip that one. This to me, I think, is the most important, because in this work, and again, this is why it's important to do our own work about our self-esteem and our egos, because in the circle, like this, when you're in that circle, we're all equal. And this is by Dave Chief in Oglola, Lakota. He says, in the circle, we are all equal. When in the circle, no one is in front of you, no one is behind you, no one is above you, no one is below you. The sacred circle is designed to create unity. And this gets to, we really see the work of equity as the work of humanity and the work of connection. And again, if you go to the next slide, we have some resources for you. The slideshow is open. You should be able to access it, and you should have all of what it is that we presented. Sorry. So here are some book recommendations. Carolyn, do you want to just talk about, maybe highlight one book? If somebody
Yes.
one, what would it be? And go to the next slide.
If I were to highlight one book, I love The Deepest Well by Nadine Burgess.
I love The Deepest Well also. I would say one of my favorites though, so The Book of Joy, you know, connect with joy. It's not just about, you know, we have some great recommendations. You know, we've already talked about building a culture of dignity, of belonging through dignity, but also like just do that work of self. So go to the last slide, which has our connections. If there's anything in here that you want to have more information about, because we really zoom by some pieces, you can find, here's our information. You can find me. I have a website. You can also email me at marisol@mpu.org, mpunion.org. You can find me, send me a message on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever mode that you want. I am here for you. And Carolyn, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Email. I'm not as quite socially connected as Marisol is, but definitely on LinkedIn. And then my email here at the university.
So thank you for being with us. Yeah. Have a beautiful, beautiful rest of conference. Know that wherever you are loved, you are cared for.
Thank you all for joining us.
Bye-bye.